Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Infuse Your Future podcast, where we bring together people and ideas who are making the world a better place. Today, I have with us Avery Thatcher, who is a burnout recovery and prevention strategist. So I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. Hi, Avery.
Hi, Carla. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do in the world, and how you infuse people's futures?
Absolutely. So I started off my career as a registered nurse working in ICUs across Canada up here. And I noticed really early on in my career that the number one reason why adults found themselves in the ICU were because of illnesses and diseases that could be linked to chronic stress. So I started to get out of the reactive side of medicine back in 2015 and started building a business around stress management, teaching meditation and mindfulness and yoga and pranayama breathwork and all of the things. And then at the end of 2018, I had a very epic burnout experience. And it left me really frustrated because I felt like I was doing everything quote unquote right. And I still burnt out. So, being the super nerd that I am, dove back into the research, found the missing pieces of the puzzle that people are not often talking about when they talk about stress management. And I feel like we're going to talk about that today.
Yeah, I can't wait because I think a lot of people in the world, especially in the US, were burnt out, stressed out. It's just not a good recipe.
No, and there's just a lot of different contributing factors, and especially living in a capitalist society, like many of us do, it just puts different pressures on us that we have to learn how to live with because there are some sources of stress that we can remove or eliminate from our life, but there are some that we can't, like the external pressures of wherever we live. So definitely burnout rates are on the rise. And there's a lot of research around this. Indeed.com did a research study with their people that were job hunting at the time. And that was back in 2019. And they asked, like, are you feeling burnt out? And they had about 9% of the people say, yeah, I feel burnt out. Uh, Fast forward to 2022, it's 59% of that research came back as people saying that they're burnt out. And when we look at the different statistics, depending on the different working groups that you're in, the rate is actually as high as 89%, 88.75%. So really, burnout is very pervasive, and it's something that we really need to start paying attention to.
And if I'm understanding your timeline correctly, you didn't experience the burnout when you were an ICU nurse, but rather when you were an entrepreneur. Is that correct?
So I experienced the burnout while I was an entrepreneur and an ICU nurse. So I was working full-time 12-hour shift work plus running my business.
Wow.
And I, if you would ask me, I would say, actually, you know what? I don't feel stressed. I really practiced what I was preaching. I was managing my time wisely, but I was working in a very toxic ICU environment at the time. There was not a very supportive staff grouping. There was a lot of undercutting, a lot of gossip and politics, and it was just, I think, impacting me more than I realized. And I did not win the health lottery growing up, so my health has always been a little bit finicky, and it was really, I think, the tipping point for me at that point because I was working the 12-hour shift work. I was coming off a night shift, and the charge nurse looked me in the eye and she's like, "You don't look well. You should go home and rest up." And I was just like, "Okay." So she marked me down as sick for my next shift, but then I slept for 20 hours and I slept for 20 hours the next day and the day after that. And it was about a 2-year journey of some surgeries and different tests and all of the things. And now I'm the proud owner of a chronic disability and chronic illness that's never going to go away. So it just really taught me the importance of finding the actual causes of these burnout experiences and the stress impacts on the body. Because a lot of what we talk about with the meditation, mindfulness, and all of that is really just symptom management. It doesn't address the cause at all.
So true. I think most people know what burnout is, but just in case they don't, or they're confused about, well, what's burnout, what's stress, what's attributable to trauma, do you think you could define what burnout is and tell people how to assess themselves to find out if they're ready to burn out?
Great question. with a lot of the pop psychology being shared about on Instagram, trauma, stress, burnout, they're all these trendy words that I think is really important to define. So I'm really glad that you asked that. So stress is our body's natural response to anything different. Really. So when we go and change jobs, our stress response get activated. When we have something pop out of the woods and start chasing us, stress response gets activated. These are our normal body responses to that. But the problem is that our body was not designed for our modern day capitalist life. So stressors like money stress, job insecurity, living through a pandemic, all of these other pressures that we're having, it our body's not designed for that. So then we have learned through the research that our stress response actually moves through three stages. So the stage of alarm is the holy smokes moment where you see something come out of the bushes running at you, and your stress response gets you away to safety or fights it off and then it's supposed to turn off. But again, most of our stressors don't do that. So then we move into the next stage, which is the stage of resistance. And so this is where our body is working with all of its supportive mechanisms to give us the energy that we need to maintain this increased demand. Because when we're stressed, our body's asking for a lot more energy. So this is where a lot of us are living our lives right now, in the stage of resistance, where our body is like coping okay with the amount of stress. But inevitably, it becomes too much and we kind of tip over into that final stage, the stage of exhaustion. And so this is where burnout really happens. It's where our body loses its ability to cope with the increased energy demand of chronic stress. So if you're looking for a definition of burnout, that's what it is. It's your life jacket, your body catching you and saying like, okay, we're out of energy. You have to do something different. And that's really where burnout comes in. Now, trauma. Trauma is also another really trendy word, and unfortunately is being misused, which is just the way that some of these things go, especially with media and how they bring out these topics. But really, trauma is an injury to the nervous system. So most of us do experience very distressing things over the course of our life. But just because it's really distressing doesn't mean it's actually injured your nervous system, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have trauma. It means that you definitely deserve help and you can definitely get support for that distressing experience. But if you don't have that injury to the nervous system, then textbook definition says that it's not trauma. Now, why this matters is because if you actually have an injury to your nervous system and you try and do things, those regular stress management strategies that are talked about a lot, like meditation, mindfulness, what have you, you are actually at risk of either re-injuring your nervous system or making it worse. One of the clearest examples I have of this is myself. I, you know, I, as working as an ICU nurse, I don't think you can live through it as an ICU nurse without getting some degree of trauma. There's just a lot that you see and that you walk through. So I do have some PTSD and things from that. And so I was going through a really difficult time, and the PTSD was close to the surface. Lots of little mini flashbacks and things. Anyway, I was feeling really stressed out one day, decided to sit down and do a little meditation. And all of a sudden, I was outside walking my dog, and I had no recollection of how I got from sitting on my meditation cushion to walking my dog. Because when we're in this stressed out state with our traumatic nervous system being triggered, we do something that's called dissociation. And when you completely dissociate, it means that you can lose track of time, space, anything. So like I was lucky that I was wearing a jacket because it was -20 outside. I was lucky that I knew where I was, that the dog was on a leash. Like all of these things can be high risk if you have trauma and you're in a triggered, activated trauma state and you're using some of these stress management strategies. So that's why I feel like it's really important to understand the difference. Now, that was a lot of information, Carla, in a very short period of time, and I talk really fast. So, any
That was a
questions?
lot of information. I had so many questions but I didn't want to interrupt you because you were in a great flow.
So, what are your questions?
Maybe we could start with, gosh, there's just so many questions. So, stress, I'm assuming that you were talking about toxic stress, right? Because there's also positive stress.
Absolutely.
There's stress that doesn't lead to nervous system injury, stress that's motivating, like healthy stress, as opposed
Yeah,
to
the
unhealthy
eustress.
stress.
Eustress. Technical name for the positive stress. Yes.
Oh, I learned something new just now. That's cool.
There you go.
Do you want to talk about the difference between eustress and toxic stress?
Yeah, so really The difference is all in the perspective because any stressor has the chance to be harmful or helpful. And it really just depends on your ability to see that through a perspective that either keeps your body really resistant to the negative health effects of stress or whether it can work with it. And so a lot of that works on there's something that's called the stress curve. It was developed by Robert M. Yerkes and John Dillingham Dotson back in 1908, but it keeps getting tested over the time and it still stands up. And it just explains the relationship between productivity and pressure. So even with the things that people would label as toxic stress, if there's the right amount of productivity and pressure that's happening in relation to those, then you can stay in that peak flow state. But if even you get too many use stressors, too many of those positive stressors piled on, it'll still send you over the other side of that curve. And that brings you through those 3 stages of stress that we talked about before. So when we look at positive or toxic stress, uh, I encourage you to see the activities that you're doing, these stressors that you're encountering as either serving or sabotaging. And we look at our emotions this way. We can look at any situation this way. We can look at our personality traits this way. Because when we remove ourselves from good, bad, positive, negative, toxic, those terms that we have all of this association with, we can actually see things really on that spectrum. So when we can look at our stressors as, this new job that I'm starting causes me stress for sure. Is it going to serve or sabotage me? How can I make sure that I stay in the serving side? So I think that's a way to help make sure that your perspective is aligned to try and keep things in the non-damaging stress side of things.
So would you agree to that one way to try to mitigate or manage stress would be to kind of work on your outlook of the stress? I mean, some things we put ourselves in, right? For instance, if we decide we want to do a marathon and we go out and we run 9 miles a day, if we decide to do that, then that's probably a positive stressor. But if we are thrown into a situation where we're forced to run 9 miles a day, that's going to be a trauma.
It could be distressing for sure. It could be very hard on your body. And this is where instead of just like focusing your perspective, I would encourage you to understand your motivation. So when we're looking for change or goals or anything like that, we want to understand, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to fulfill my life? Am I doing this because somebody told me I should? Are I doing this because I feel like I need to prove something? And even if it's something that someone tells you you should do or something which you need to be proven to be able to do, it isn't inherently wrong. Again, looking at it serving and sabotaging.
Yeah, very good point. I thought it was interesting too what you said about damage to the nervous system, that trauma is damage to the nervous system, which I think is a very interesting way to look at it. And, obviously I agree with you. But there's a lot of talk about PTSD and CPTSD, the complex
Hmm.
PTSD out there. And again, like you said, everyone has different ways that they cope. And the same person or two different people in the same situation handle it differently. And so one might end up with PTSD and the other one not.
Hmm.
Some of it goes back to resilience, but I'm wondering if you wanted to expand on that a little bit. I think for me, part of it is the repair work that's around the trauma. If you have people in your environment that maybe the trauma happened, but they helped you work it out or helped you work through it, helped you find ways to cope with it versus if you were still stuck in it. So that perhaps even if part of your trauma is growing up with abusive parents, say, if those parents also loved you and tried to work around the traumas that they inflicted, you would probably be able to function better as an adult than someone who did not have that resource. And the same with an intense job like being an ICU nurse or an emergency room doctor or a firefighter, a police officer, any of these things. I would imagine that it's also the environment. You see very traumatic things in your job. And if you have a supportive company there, helping you work through it. You have a group of friends with similar things helping you work through it, a place where you can talk safely about what you've seen without being ridiculed or sidelined or given added pressures of, well, why aren't you working a 24-hour shift? You can't be sick. You're an ICU nurse. That would also play a lot into it.
It can, absolutely. And I think all of those things that you talked about, those help widen your resilience window. So there's this concept about your resilience window that Dr. Dan Siegel talks about. He's the one that coined the term. He's one of the leading researchers in trauma and polyvagal theory. And so this really talks about our two alarm lines, that either we get too much stress and that sets off the alarm bells and triggers a traumatic nervous system response, or when we go too calm and too deregulated, it triggers the bottom line. And this is generally where the freeze or fawn response can come in. And so for that example that I shared earlier, when I was meditating, when I was in that triggered trauma state, my window was very narrow. So when I kind of settled in and calmed my nervous system down, I triggered the trauma response because I deregulated too much. So when we look at ways that we can help widen our window, all of the things that you suggested absolutely can help. But there are definitely times where you need really specific strategies from very highly trained professionals to be able to work through the progressive exposure therapy to help you train your nervous system not to essentially overreact to different stressors and scenarios. It's really tricky in CPTSD because the main difference between PTSD and CPTSD is that PTSD, there's generally one specific incident, or if you are lucky enough to have multiple cases of PTSD, there's multiple incidents, but there's a pinpoint in time that you can say, okay, so that's where my trauma came from. With CPTSD, which is commonly seen in childhood traumatic experiences that maybe weren't physically violent, but emotionally and mentally and verbally violent, these spaces of emotional unsafety generally create a lot more CPTSD. And that's a lot harder, but not impossible, to work with because you can't trigger the one moment and know what you have to work to do that progressive exposure with. So I think yes, some of the environment can help prevent the traumatic injury from happening and can help heal it, but really it kind of depends.
And it's definitely important to get professional care, especially professional care from people that really understand what exactly it is you went through. For instance, if you have the PTSD and it's from a specific event, ideally you'd be able to talk to a professional that had experience with that particular type of trauma. And with the CPSD, it's even more important, I feel, to find someone who really understands what that is in order to make it kind of prevent it from getting worse in a sense.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for that person to understand the physiology behind it because there's a lot of people that are saying, well, I had this traumatic experience and this worked for me, so I can help you with this. But everybody's physiology is different. Everybody's experience of that same traumatic event, like you mentioned earlier, is going to be different. And so knowing which tool in the trauma healing toolbox to use is so important because for some people, some of the strategies are going to work really well. Other ones can really cause some deeper injuries. Even though it worked for this one person, it can re-injure or just completely different injury to that person. So I think it's, yeah, really important to work with someone that actually truly understands the physiology of trauma.
Yeah. And also to keep trying because, like you said, some tools will work for some people and not for others, and vice versa. So, not try meditation because it failed for some people, but to try different things. And if you try it and it fails, try something else. And if you've tried a few things and they fail and you haven't gone for professional support yet, definitely go for professional support.
Hmm.
Right.
Agreed.
So, how do you support people that are going through burnout?
Great question. So for people that are going through burnout, especially if they're a high achiever, they're just like, okay, give me the things which I need to do because I just need to get over this and get back to the way my life is. But then they try and do too many things at once, and then it's impossible to maintain. They lose their consistency, and then they kind of fall back down that burnout train. So really, people have to first recover their energy. And now when we think about burnout, typically it's talked about in this like circular model where you're sitting at the top of the circle. This is where you're like in your peak performance space, and then things get really overwhelming. You take on maybe a little bit too much or maybe a lot of it too much, and then you kind of like overwhelm yourself and end up in burnout. And then you slow down enough, kind of get your energy back, and everybody kind of feels like they're back up at the top. But the truth is, it's more like a marble bouncing down a hill. So you kind of start up at your peak flow and then you come down into burnout, and then you recover a bit of your energy, but you don't get as high. And then you go back into burnout, and then you come back in to get your energy, and you keep like working your way down lower and lower until you're kind of just hovering around that burnout line where you feel good one day and then you have no energy the next day, and then you're good for a day or two and then you're out for a couple more. So really, we have to learn how to recover and keep that energy. That's step one. And by doing that, then you're actually able to start optimizing your habits. And this is where you can start to look at small shifts. I'm gonna say that again because it's super important, everybody. Small shifts, smaller than you'd think. And it's these kinds of things that are going to create that consistent change over time. And then finally, we have to start looking at all of the different mindsets and beliefs that are contributing to you perpetuating burnout within yourself. Because we grew up with lots of different belief systems and thoughts and experiences, rewarding achievement. So that way you feel like the only way you should be accepted and loved and receiving all of that is because you achieved something. So then you're driven to achieve more. So all of these beliefs, we also need to slow down and really look at again and bring them back onto that scale of serving versus sabotaging to know, how do I really work with this part of me? Or do I just need to let this part of me go? So those are the three steps, really. You have to recover your energy first, so that way you have a little bit more to give so that you can optimize your habits, and then you elevate your impact by really working on optimizing those thought patterns.
Yeah. And I think two of the key things you mentioned are habits and belief. For me, belief is super important. I mean, you have to believe in yourself. You have to believe it's going to get better. And as long as you don't believe that, you're going to keep self-sabotaging yourself. If deep down you believe you don't deserve this, or you're not good enough for this, or, the world is out to get me, or I'm a failure. If all those little sub-programs are going on in your brain, you can try to do all these different modalities, but they're all going to fail because you haven't changed that core issue, which is you don't believe that you're worthy of being in a better spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then also the habits. I mean, it's so easy to pick up negative habits. And then even if we do believe in ourselves, if we can't figure out the habit process and get good habits, then it's going to be tough to make it to the next level or reach our goals.
Mm-hmm. I very much agree. And I think if you're listening right now and you're thinking, like, okay, but how do I actually believe in myself? Because I can say I'm enough until I'm blue in the face and it doesn't make a difference. I don't believe it, it just goes away. It's really normal for that thought. And it's one of your thought habits that easily just dismisses that because your brain uses filters to process the 80,000 bits of information that you encounter every day. So you have a filter in your brain potentially right now that says, well, I'm not enough. So when you say that, your brain's just like, nope, and lets it go. So one of the easy ways to start working with all of those beautiful affirmations that are put out there all over the place, there's so many great ones. But if your nervous system is dismissing them, add these two little words. Put the two words, what if, in front of it. What if I'm enough? What if I'm smart enough to figure this out? What if I'm lovable just as I am? And so by adding those two words, you're really bypassing the part of your brain that's going to be like, nope, in the bin. So then you're able to start the conversation, and it just shifts that whole nervous system response so that way you don't react to it. So that's my suggestion. Try what if formations.
That's a great suggestion. I love that. Now, what's the name of your company?
So it's called Becoming Avery,
Mhm.
because as I mentioned earlier with my epic burnout experience, I struggled so much with the loss of identity because I saw myself as this go, go, go person. I saw myself as this healthy and fit person. I saw myself as this ICU nurse. And literally overnight, all of that was yanked away from me. And I I tried for 2 years to find the middle ground, to like find that balance between who I am now and what I used to be capable of and what my life is going to be. And so I finally decided I needed to start over. I needed a fresh start. And so for me, part of that fresh start was changing my name. So my company is called Becoming Avery because I spent 37 years of my life as Heather. And it's really the process of becoming Avery that has helped me help the most people.
Wow, that's very deep. And I feel like a lot of people, including myself, are in that situation where we've been doing something for 20, 30 years and we know we need to change it, but our identity is so wrapped around that that it's hard to imagine yourself in a different situation. And it's never easy to start over.
No,
So to just kind of drop everything and find yourself, unfortunately, it sounds like with you, it wasn't a choice.
it was
It
not.
just it
No,
got yanked away from you and you had to go on this journey and then you became Avery. So what was
exactly.
that like for you?
Ugly. It was a lot of resistance, especially in the beginning, because I wasn't ready to accept the amount of loss that had come into my life. And so one of my programs that I do with groups, I always do it with them because I believe the Elevate programs, when you're working through some of those belief systems and the mindset reboot kind of work. And so every time I run that, I always do it with them because I feel like you always have different layers to unlock. Because every time you peel back one layer, you're like, oh, there's another stinkier one that I need to deal with. So you kind of dig into that. So anyway, I was working through that, and there's this one exercise that you do where you write a grief letter to someone in your past, to the life which you thought you'd be living by now, to whatever. And it's a letter that you just really let it out. Never going to get sent. You just need to process and release some of the emotion you've got stored inside of you. So I always journal at night and brain dump on my treadmill. So I've got a little treadmill and I was walking and I got a little desk. So I was there typing away on my little iPad and was just writing to my chronic illness. And I was like, kind of sucks that you're here. Not a fan. Uh, but I kind of want to figure this out. And then I got really angry. And I started, oh, I was typing so loud and really heavy and it was just like letting it all out. And the anger was just pouring out like 2.5 years of anger. And then all of a sudden, it dawned on me that this resistance that I was holding, this like trying to push it away, this part of me was still a part of me. And all parts of me deserve love and compassion. So instead of trying to shove that part away, I started writing about how I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to listen. I'm going to learn how to best support this part of me. I'm going to learn how to work with this. And then, oh, Carla, the ugly crying that came out after that. And I was like, I couldn't even stand up. It was unsafe to walk on the treadmill. I walked over to the floor and just like collapsed in a puddle of ugly, ugly tears for a good 30 minutes as all of that grief just really washed out. So it was an ugly process, but a beautiful process at the same time.
I can understand that. I really feel for the person on that treadmill. But I have to say, I am like super impressed that you're on the treadmill and then you're typing and then you're typing, and throwing out all your energy and then you're crying and you're doing all of this on the treadmill before you finally collapse. Like that's amazing to me.
So it wasn't like I was running though. I was walking nice
Oh,
and
okay.
slow. Yeah.
But still, that's a lot of hand-eye coordination.
Yeah, I suppose. Maybe it's the ICU nurse in me that can like hold a baby and be like
I think
typing on a computer
so.
and running machines. I don't know.
I think so. That's the high achiever.
Yeah, definitely the high achiever.
So how long have you been Avery?
Oh, I've been Avery for 2 years.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So how does it feel to be Avery?
It feels like home. So I
Mm.
never really connected to Heather, my previous name. It just felt like a name. I didn't really use it as much. However, my entire business was wrapped around it. So changing my name to Avery, I definitely got caught up in the core fear of fearing the process because it was a lot of work to change all of that. But yeah, the name Avery really just feels like me more than any other name ever could. And when I talk to other people, people that have known me for a while or people I just met, they can't see me as Heather, but they see me as Avery. So I think, yeah, it's there. I saw this video on TikTok ages ago, ages and ages ago. And it talked about this concept of what if we were given a name, but then somewhere in our 20s or 30s, when we really sort of discover more about who we are, we get a name change day. And so that's where we get to pick our new name or choose to stick with the name that we were given. But we just normalize that experience. And I remember when I started sharing my name change, people were popping out of the woodwork of either they've changed one of their names, either first, middle, or last, or they knew somebody that did it. And it's actually more common than I thought, which was comforting.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. When I was in fourth grade, I wanted to change my name, and I ended up just going for my initials, first and middle name. I know quite a few people that have changed their last name, but I'm curious how you got to that point. I mean, there are a lot of people that kind of change their careers or go through an identity crisis, but not a lot of, or at least that I know of, not a lot of people have actually changed their name. So, what prompted you to do that? How did you think about it?
Yeah. So what really I was sitting on the floor and chatting with my partner. We'd been married for 3 years. We'd been married for 3 months before I got sick. So in sickness or in health came early. Um
Um,
yeah, so I was sitting on the floor and I was just talking with him and I was saying like I don't think Heather is here. Like, I don't think that I have Heather anymore. And it was just such a weird sort of dissociating kind of thing. Because I was like, it doesn't, like, I don't feel like anything that I used to be. And so it was really that disconnect of not feeling at home in my body anymore. And I remember talking to my therapist at the time, and she was like, some people they go through changes and those changes can happen gradually or quickly, but they still feel some connection to the driving factor, that little force inside of them. And she's like, and it sounds like you don't. And I didn't. There was nothing really about who I was that I could see moving forward. And so I think it was really that moment where I thought, like, I think I have to change my name. And when I chatted that to my partner, he was just like, well, that's weird, but I'll support you in it. Do you know what name you want? And I was like, I have no idea. So I went to a bunch of baby name blogs and just started scrolling through, and Avery was the only name that jumped out. And I remember the first time he called me Avery, it just something shifted and I
wow.
felt things settle. And that's when I really started to make progress in managing my disability and illness because I was no longer fighting it. This was just who I was. So
Mm,
I think for me, it was really the catalyst to healing.
wow, that's so cool. Yeah, names I think are very important. I took forever to pick my kids' names, but at the end of the day, I chose their names. So what if they decide they don't like it and they want to change it later? I'd
Yeah,
be all for it for them, even though I'm in love with the names I gave them, of course.
that's it. Yes. So when I told my parents, let me tell you, I was shaking like a leaf. I was just like, I could hear it in my voice. It was so, so scary because I know that they put a lot of thought into that name for me. And uh, I shared the reasons why. I shared the benefits that I'd already experienced. And they they both were just like, okay, like it's gonna take us some time because it's been a while. We've called you Heather all your life. But and it wasn't a perfect transition, but they advocate for me. So for some of the friends of the family that don't get it and refuse to call me Avery, uh, my mom will be the first to be like, her name's Avery. So it's great. I have other advocates in my corner as well. And it was really moving because I had done videos for other entrepreneurs. I've done like testimonial videos for things. Within a week of me announcing that online, people were changing the names in those
Wow.
videos. They were changing the names in the testimonials. People went above and beyond to accommodate my shift. And some of these are strangers that I had met for like literally a half-hour interview. So it just really moved me, the compassion that people can have for others,
Yeah, that gives me goosebumps.
right? It
Yeah,
was
I'm happy for
powerful.
you.
Thank you.
So what do you do in your company? Like you have this company, Becoming Avery. What do you do?
So I do work with some people one-on-one, um, especially high achievers that feel like they're just so swamped and so drowning in everything else that they've got going on. They need somebody to really just hold them accountable to the changes that they want to make. But I do have those group programs that we talked about that go with those three phases of recovering from burnouts, the recovery, the optimization, and the elevation. But we also have an app because number one, the person that said you need to have 30 minutes of self-care every day, I want to meet them and be like, why? Why did you say 30 minutes? Because when you're this busy, like, let's be real, trying to carve out 30 minutes of time, impossible. Where are you going to find that? And in this app, we really talk about utilizing those pockets of time. So the 30 seconds before you go on to your next task, the 60 seconds before you go into the grocery store, just the little moments of time in between. Instead of trying to carve out time for a 90-minute yoga class, try a 15-minute one. You can still get all of these little benefits. And so that's really what our Flow State app is all about. Plus, it really helps people like me that really struggle with energy management because I really enjoy yoga. I enjoy teaching yoga, but if I were to do a 90-minute class, I would need to rest for 3 hours before then, not lying. And I would probably need a good, 2 hour lay down after where I would just like lay down in the dark with earplugs in order to recover from that. But 15 minutes, my energy can handle that. So yeah, it's really about looking for those little pockets of time, and that's what the app really helps with.
And what's the name of your app?
It's called the Flow State app. We're also going to be relaunching it with some extra components, and it's going to be called the Productivity Partner app. Because when we look at productivity, stress management and energy management play a more important role than time management does. So learning how to manage those two pieces to be able to set yourself up for your most productive work block, that's the goal with that part of the app. And we're going to be adding a couple of other things in there, but those are the two app names.
Oh, that's awesome. So is there anything else that you'd like the audience, any advice for them before we
I
sign
think,
on?
yeah, sure. So I think if you only get one thing from this episode, I want it to be this: that always do your best doesn't mean always be perfect. Your best is going to look different moment to moment, day to day. So if you have 40% energy and you give 40% energy, that was your best. So be gentle with yourself, be honest with yourself, and just remember that you don't have to go, go, go at 100% all the time in order to be at your best.
Really good words of advice. Well, I really want to thank you for being on the show. We talked about a lot of really cool things. Some of them I could make a whole episode out of, and I would just love to sit here and talk forever about it.
I'm just so grateful that there's platforms like yours where we can have these kind of conversations because I think it's really important for us to realize that we're not alone. And one of the podcasts that I was on recently, it's called the Trusted Friend Podcast. And she said that your story could be somebody else's survival guide. So I think it's really important to have these kind of conversations. So thank you for holding space for that, Carla.
Yeah, that's deep. You're welcome. I'll have all of your contact information in the show notes, but do you want to tell people the best way to get in touch with you? Or I guess if they just want your app, they just go to the App Store and type in the flow state, right?
That's right. Yes. So that's one option. If you're looking for a social media platform, Instagram is a good place to find me. You can find me there at The Truth About Burnout. And then you can also find me on my website at Becoming Avery. And so on that website, there are a ton of free resources, like some of those 15-minute yoga classes. But we also have a self-sabotage quiz where you can help figure out your own self-sabotage style. So if you feel like self-sabotage might be something that's getting in your way, I'd recommend go checking out that quiz.
That sounds great. And I can't wait to go check out the Flow State app.
We have to let me know what you think.
All right. Great having you on. Take care.